Without further delay, I would like to introduce Professor Abhijit Sen, who would be chairing today's session. Professor Sen is Member Planning Commission with the Government of India. He has earlier held teaching posts at the Universities of Sussex, Oxford and Cambridge, and is currently on the executive committees of University of Delhi, IIT Delhi, and the National Centre for Agricultural Policy. Professor Sen, if I could request you.
Okay, welcome everybody. I suppose my first task is to introduce the speaker. Anyone who knows this basic area would have at least heard the name Angus Deaton. Angus is a professor of economics and international affairs, that I do know, at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Angus is, of course, well known to anyone who is an economist for his work in consumer economics. I mean, how people behave. I think that, I suppose, is the general area. But he's chosen this time to talk on evaluation. And I think a lot of his talk will be around the practice and assumptions regarding evaluation, and without actually trying to guess what he's going to talk about, I think it's just simply let it go on.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be here again after too long a delay. I think I'm going to go and stand at the that's all right. So I'm going to talk about evaluations. Everybody's interested in evaluations, and more generally about evidence for policy. I think it's pretty much no one disagrees that it's a good idea to use evidence when designing policies. But once you get beyond that basic agreement, there are all sorts of views about what sort of evidence you should use, how you should obtain it, whether some kinds of evidence are better than other kinds of evidence. And much of what I'll talk about is what is sometimes referred to as a hierarchy of evidence, in that there's some types of evidence which should be given privileges over other types of evidence, that they're better, they're more credible. And in particular, I will talk quite a lot about randomized controlled trials. I'm going to explain in some detail how randomized controlled trials work. For those of you who don't think about this every day, like I do, I will comment on this at the sort of ground level. But a phrase that you often hear is that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. That's a term that really comes from medicine, where randomized controlled trials are used very heavily, but they're becoming very heavily used in development economics too. want to talk also about how we move from the evidence to the policy. So you regard this as really two steps. One is you develop the evidence, you go out into the village and you see what happens if you implement some policy, and then you've got an answer. And then you have to come back to Delhi or go to the block headquarters or whatever, and you have to try to explain to people what they should do differently based on the evidence that you've gathered. And what's very important to realize is that these two steps, which are conceptually separate, the gathering of evidence and the using of evidence, the whole policy-based, evidence-based policy depends on both of those steps. And your evidence-based policy will be just as strong as the weakest of those two links. So if you have super good evidence, it's no good at all if you can't translate it into policy. So that step has to be thought about really very hard too. And a lot of this talk will be about that step. I'm going to use some running examples which are sort of selected for Indian relevance. And I'll just scatter these around as I go. One is about building dams. Does the construction of dams lead to poverty reduction, or does it lead to poverty increase? And are building dams a good idea? Another one is sanitation. We have a student at Princeton who's spending most of his time in India working on the total sanitation campaign and its effects on child mortality and child health. How should such schemes be implemented? Do the ones we have actually work, and what do we learn from them? Microfinance is a perpetually fashionable topic. Is microfinance an effective tool for poverty reduction? And there's lots of evidence being developed around that. Food subsidies, I'm thinking here of the PDS versus cashing out the PDS, cash or food. Conditional cash transfers, how do we develop evidence for that? And in general, I'm interested in evaluating this phrase. Every time I put something in quotes, it means you shouldn't really take it literally. So this term, finding out what works, which is sort of one of my bet noirs, I'll try to explain that. And the statements that you often hear are things like rigorous evaluation of conditional cash transfers has shown that they work. And that statement is sort of, and therefore that leads to everybody should have conditional cash transfers. Well, what does that statement mean? Does it have any value? Is it true? Does it mean anything for India? Does it mean anything for anyone? All right, let me develop a little bit of background. And this, I'm not sure how relevant this is, so I'll go through this quickly. There's a general feeling over recent years that the whole of development economics and the whole development project has been something of a failure. That it hasn't really done very well. If you look at the bottom of this thing, for many years people would argue that there'd been little or no progress. And I think people don't really argue that to the same extent now, though it does remain very unclear whether the development effort by rich countries, by the World Bank, by other international organizations, has really been positive or negative. I mean, I'm thinking of the fact that there's been a lot of poverty reduction in the world. There's been poverty reduction in India. The question is whether it was economic development or the development project that did that, or whether it would have just happened by itself. One of the things that people like to point to was the cycling fashions of the World Bank. I've listed some of them there. The bank sort of started out working on infrastructure. It's gone through a whole bunch of other things, including structural adjustment, education, health, gender, political economy, governance, and now it seems to have gone back to infrastructure again. I don't really want to single out the World Bank, but the development community as a whole, or at least what I think of as the community of developers. And a lot of the criticism here has been that this process has been heavily influenced by fashion, by politics, especially in the rich world, but heavily unconstrained. I don't know if you can be heavily unconstrained. Very unconstrained by evidence, and that evidence has played really very little part in the cycling of fashions over time. Now, there are many possible stories for this state of affairs, but one story is that there's been a failure to learn from experience. So this brings me back to my evidence-based policy. That there's been no systematic, rigorous, notice the quotes around rigorous. Rigorous is now also one of my pet hates, because it's used as a code word to mean something very different than rigorous. But there's been no systematic, rigorous evaluation procedures for projects. The casual, empirical evaluation of projects does not give credible answers, and we need to develop much more rigorous and credible evidence on what works. And the argument has been, and again, just let me pick on the World Bank, if the World Bank had done this on all of its projects in the past, we would know, by now, we would know what works and what doesn't work, and poverty would be history. Sort of very great burden that one could put on the World Bank if it's done its evaluations properly. We wouldn't need the World Bank anymore or anything else. And the question is whether this sort of passion for evidence-based policy is for real, or whether it's just the latest turn of the wheel of fashion. And of course, there's a bit of both. If you look at some of this empirical analysis, I spent a lot of my time doing empirical analysis one way or another. And it's certainly true that if you go back and look at a lot of the empirical work that was done in development economics or in project evaluation, it often was indeed extremely weak. There were correlations between things that clearly had nothing to do with causation. One of the ones I remember, each of us has our own moment on the road to Damascus when you realize that the world has taken a really bad turn. And I remember reading this paper about Chinese railway stations, or I think it was about Chinese railway stations. It becomes sort of mythological in my mind because I was so knocked back by it, in which there was a paper in which it looked at whether places that had railway stations had done better than places that didn't have railway stations. Now, of course, if you think about this, it's just completely absurd, because places that have railway stations don't have railway stations by accident. There's a railway station there because it needs a railway station. And so, first of all, I just couldn't believe that anyone would ever do this. And then, when they'd done it, they then noticed that there might be a problem and had fallen back on all sorts of econometric tricks, which just made the whole thing worse. So you were left with this total incredible mess of stuff. And I thought, is that really the best we can do? Well, randomized controlled trials, which I will talk about in the next slide, seem to offer a solution to these issues. That they actually establish causality. They offer a solution to the statistical problems of bias, of selection, of omitted variables. In the medical literature, it's called confounding. And these arguments have been very successful in the World Bank among foundations. JPAL at MIT and its branches have been doing many experiments around the world. And there's been a great chorus of approval. Here are some of my favorite. Revolutionized social policy during the 21st century, just as randomized trials revolutionized medicine during the 20th. And that expresses a widespread belief that randomized controlled trials revolutionized medicine. I actually don't think that's true, but anyway. And then this wonderful piece of jingoism from the British Medical Journal. Britain has given the world Shakespeare, Newtonian physics, the theory of evolution, parliamentary democracy, and the randomized trial. Can't really do better than that. I wanted to work something about India in there, but you know, I thought I'd get it. But it's just gorgeous stuff. Okay, so let's talk about what a randomized controlled trial is. So you have what I call the trial population. These are the people you're going to do an experiment on. And they're randomly divided into two groups. So the random is a big deal here. Random is an odd word. No one really quite knows exactly what random means or how you know whether it was random or not. But people use it very widely. But let's say you've got a computer random number generator, which of course is usually completely deterministic, but never mind. You've got a random number generator, and you divide this group that you're going to do the experiment into two groups, the experimentals and controls. And the idea of the randomness is that at least if you have a big enough group of people, dividing them up this way, there can't be any differences between the two groups. That's what randomization applies to. So one group is called the experimentals, and they get this treatment, they get this policy done to them. The controls, on the other hand, get nothing, or they get what they would have gotten otherwise. So then the average outcome in the experimental group, so think of this for the moment as like a drug. So you give this drug to the people in the experimental group, and then you measure how well they are afterwards, and you take the average outcome in the control group, and the difference between these two tells us if the treatment works, and by how much on average. So you've got these two groups, experimental control. You do the treatment on the experimentals, you get an average for them, an average for the other group. The groups can't be different because they can't be different because of the randomization. So you're just comparing those two averages. And that tells you whether the treatment worked or not. That's a lot. Gives you this average treatment effect. I want to emphasize average here. In general, because each person in the trial will respond differently to this treatment. I mean, that's a very important thing to realize. You know, if you know, two of us have headaches, and I take an aspirin, and Abhijit takes an aspirin, I might get better and he might not get better because there's differences between people. And if you think of social policy too, I mean, somebody might like to have their PDS turned into cash, and someone might not like. People are different. And what the trial gives you is an average effect. You cannot observe from the trial the outcomes for each individual, but the trial gives us the average for the group. And that's a lot. So I'm going to say some bad things about randomized controlled trials, which you might have guessed. Not building up too much tension here. But I don't want to say ultimately bad things, because it's a big thing to know what that average is. It's just there's lots of other things we want to know too. And that's not everything that we want to know. Doing this randomized controlled trial means you don't make assumptions, and you know, economists are always being accused of making ridiculous assumptions, and we do, but this, you don't have to make many assumptions to get this to work. You get this absence of bias because of randomization, it's like a true effect, and also it's got to be, this is a causal effect. And for those of you who are social scientists, you'll know we struggle with causality all the time. You don't really know whether the chicken is causing the egg or the egg is causing the chicken. And that's always a problem in correlations and everything we look at. So the fact that the trial establishes causality, because that's the only difference between the two groups, that one group got the treatment and the other one didn't. So that difference has got to be due to the treatment. And that, again, is a huge thing. And when you think the extent to which we've struggled with all these things over the years, that's a huge advantage. So you don't have to make very much assumptions. You get a lot for those assumptions. Big advantage. The question really is whether this is